Thank you very much, and again, thank you to the organizers of the conference and to Open Ukraine for inviting me. As Bruce polls indicate, the issue of corruption and fighting corruption is on the lips of virtually everyone in Ukraine, including all the major politicians. Indeed, one of the first words that came out of the mouth of the new Prime Minister was the need to fight corruption. Corruption, as has been talked about earlier at the conference, exists at all levels of Ukrainian society. One can find here grand corruption, namely the corruption of high government officials. One can find small and petty levels of corruption in terms of social services and education and in healthcare. And one can find corruption in the institutions that are supposed to be fighting corruption, in the courts, in the bureaucracy, and in government itself. The Ukrainian government likes to highlight its successes in the fight against corruption, and indeed, on paper, and to some extent in practice, they have some genuine successes to talk about. We already heard earlier about the changes in the police, but there has been changes in the military. There have been progress made in terms of promoting transparency in government procurement and in income declarations, and in the establishment of specific anti-corruption agencies, most notably the Anti-Corruption Bureau. Yet in many ways, the fight against corruption and the key group that has been leading that charge has not been the government, but has been civil society. And you can find it in the press and in other NGOs who have consistently demanded that the reform process continued when it appeared that the government was wavering. I think it's fair to say that the civil society continues to hold the government's feet to the fire. It wants to see members of the Yanukovych regime punished for their acts of corruption and for their criminal actions against the protesters at the Maidan. Their expectations, I think, are high, and one does not really want to decrease this pressure and these expectations, because one wants to create the notion of a moral hazard in order to prevent these things from happening again. Indeed, I'm still waiting for some bankers to go to jail in light of the 2008 financial crisis in the United States, and yet none have. And as a result, we have not dealt with the question in the United States of moral hazard, and there is the risk that this can happen again. So it is important to pursue these prosecutions, to show the strength of the legal system and to demonstrate why this shouldn't occur. But even under the best conditions, such attempts to find past acts of corruption is a very long process with no guarantee that even most or all of the guilty will actually be punished and brought to justice, nor is there any guarantee that all the money that they have stolen will ever be returned. Therefore, the challenge for civil society in Ukraine today is to maintain this demand for accountability without becoming disillusioned that it's not meeting expectations. Eventually, I think, over time, Ukrainian civil society will have to look forward and be satisfied with small steps, as opposed to only and consistently looking backwards and waiting for big trials to punish the major offenders. Nevertheless, what I want to emphasize in this discussion is that the bottom-up support in the fight against corruption is there and present in Ukraine, and is indeed one of the most constructive forces in Ukrainian society. What is less clear is whether the top-down support for the fight against corruption exists, and this has come to a head in the controversy surrounding the bureaucracy's office. I am, in a past lifetime, a legal historian, and I have spent various hours in libraries looking at the history of the Russian bureaucracy, going all the way back to 1722 when it was founded. And for almost 300 years in imperial and in Soviet history, it has existed as the eyes of the sovereign, with broad administrative and coercive powers, even the powers to initiate legislation, which is a unique responsibility and power that no Western bureaucracy or prosecutor's office would ever even imagine having. But it has existed under the direct control of the sovereign, as opposed to being an independent and impartial institution of justice. And as it has been introduced in the Ukrainian constitution, the bureaucracy is one of the few institutions that is technically not part of the executive branch, meaning that it is not under the control or the supervision of the Prime Minister, but reports directly to the President. In fact, I think, as we've learned in the Poroshenko administration and in previous administrations, the procracy is one of the few sources of domestic power and leverage that a Ukrainian president has at his disposal under the Ukrainian constitution. Thus, I think what we've seen again, that Poroshenko is no different than his predecessors, that he needs the procracy as a critical source of domestic power, and that in turn explains his reluctance to fire Viktor Shokin for so long and to conduct a major house cleaning of this critical institution. And this has major consequences. One, Poroshenko is protecting one of the more corrupt institutions in Ukraine. The procracy clearly protects its own from criminal prosecution, and as we have seen over the past few days and weeks, it is quite happy to go after those prosecutors who decide to blow the whistle and go after corruption inside the procracy as well. Moreover, as was discussed yesterday by the Minister of Interior, an unreformed procracy has the unique ability to co-opt any other institution or any other reform that is made. And its very presence will undoubtedly undermine the reforms and the attempt to create new legal institutions. The second major consequence in this instance of Poroshenko standing by Shokin is, I think, even more critical, and that is that he has raised significant doubts about his administration's and his own personal commitment to fighting corruption. Not only has he undermined his standing in the civil society community, but he has also discouraged members of the donor community as well. I think the fight against corruption, along with terrorism and the collapse of borders, as we have discussed already here today, has emerged as one of the main global challenges of the early 21st century. There are multiple ways of fighting corruption. You can do it through technology. You can do it through adopting international treaties and conventions. You can do it on a practical level by going after red tape, by increasing salaries. There are, in fact, lots of tools in the toolkit, both domestically and internationally, that can be used, that can work in the fight against corruption. The common feature of any anti-corruption program, however, any successful one, no matter what, is that the political will has to exist in order to fight this problem. Absent support at the top, an anti-corruption program, no matter how well written, no matter how strongly supported by civil society, invariably will not succeed. Thus, the procracy has become the critical litmus test in the battle against corruption in Ukraine, and unfortunately, the results so far are not encouraging.
William, thank you very much indeed for that.